Margaret Hayes stood at the ornate front door of the Whitmore estate, her worn hands clutching a simple black purse. At 58, she'd cleaned countless homes in her 30 years of housekeeping, but never one quite like this. The mansion rose before her like something from a magazine, all white columns and polished windows catching the afternoon sun. Inside, Robert Whitmore adjusted his navy suit jacket and checked his watch for the third time. He was a man who measured life in minutes and deals, his dark hair touched with grey at the temples, his face carrying the weight of someone who'd forgotten how to smile. The past 6 months had aged him in ways money couldn't fix. When Margaret entered the living room, she noticed him first, standing rigid near the doorway. But it was the boy on the cream-colored sofa who caught her heart. 9-year-old Daniel sat with his arms crossed, his light brown hair falling across his forehead, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Something about his stillness reminded Margaret of a bird with a broken wing, too hurt to fly but not yet healed enough to try. "Mrs. Hayes," Robert's voice was businesslike, distant. "Thank you for coming. As I mentioned on the phone, my son Daniel hasn't spoken since my wife left us 6 months ago. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong. They call it selective mutism, brought on by trauma." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I need someone who can manage the house and, well, just be here. I travel frequently for business." Margaret nodded slowly, watching the boy. She'd raised 3 children of her own, and buried a husband 10 years back. Life had taught her that sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and that healing doesn't follow a schedule. "I understand, Mr. Whitmore," she said gently. "Would it be all right if I sat with Daniel for a moment?" Robert seemed surprised but gestured his approval before retreating to his study, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Margaret settled onto the sofa, not too close, leaving space for Daniel to breathe. She didn't try to make him look at her. Instead, she simply sat there, her presence as undemanding as sunshine. "You know," she said softly, as if talking to herself, "when I was about your age, I had a cat named Whiskers." "Silly name, I know." "One day, Whiskers climbed up a tree and wouldn't come down, wouldn't meow, wouldn't move. Just sat there on that branch for 2 whole days. My mother said to leave him be, that he'd come down when he was ready. And you know what? She was right. On the 3rd morning, there he was at the back door, ready for breakfast like nothing had happened." She glanced at Daniel. His eyes had shifted slightly, though he hadn't turned his head. Margaret was hired that day. The first weeks passed quietly. Margaret moved through the house with gentle efficiency, cooking meals that filled the rooms with the smell of her grandmother's recipes, roasted chicken and fresh bread, apple pie cooling on the windowsill. She never pushed Daniel to eat, but she always set a place for him, always left a little extra on his plate, just in case. Robert came and went like the tide, always rushing, always apologizing. "I have a meeting in Chicago. There's a deal in Boston. I'll be back Thursday, or maybe Friday." Margaret simply nodded. She understood running. She'd done it herself after her husband passed, throwing herself into work until her daughter had sat her down and reminded her that grief avoided is grief delayed. Each afternoon, Margaret would sit in the living room with her knitting, the soft click of her needles a steady rhythm in the quiet house. Sometimes Daniel would wander in and sit nearby, always maintaining his careful distance. She never tried to make him talk. Instead, she'd tell him stories, simple ones from her own life. "Did I ever tell you about the time my son Tommy tried to build a spaceship out of cardboard boxes? He was convinced he could fly to the moon, used up every box in the neighborhood. When he finally climbed inside and realized it wasn't going anywhere, he cried for an hour. But you know what? The next day, he turned that spaceship into a fort, and it became his favorite place to read." Sometimes when things don't work out the way we plan, they work out in a different way. One we needed more than we knew. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into her time there, Margaret was in the kitchen making soup when she heard a small sound. She turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway, holding a photograph. His eyes were red-rimmed, his small hands trembling. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and knelt down slowly, her knees protesting. She didn't reach for the photo, didn't ask questions. She just waited. Daniel held it out finally. The picture showed a beautiful woman with dark hair pulled back, laughing, her arms around a younger Daniel. The resemblance was clear in his eyes, in the shape of his face. "She's very beautiful," Margaret said softly. "I can see where you get your kind eyes." Daniel's chin quivered, and Margaret opened her arms, an invitation not a demand. He hesitated for just a moment before stepping forward, and when she wrapped him in her embrace, she felt 6 months of held tears finally break free. She held him while he cried, rocking slightly, humming an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her. She didn't tell him it would be okay. She didn't promise his mother would come back. She just held him, because sometimes that's all healing needs. Just someone to hold you while you feel what you need to feel. When Robert came home that Friday, he found them in the garden. Margaret was showing Daniel how to plant bulbs for spring, her weathered hands guiding his smaller ones as they pressed tulip bulbs into the dark earth. "You plant them now, in the fall," she was explaining, "and you wait through the whole winter. It seems like nothing's happening, like maybe they won't grow at all. But underneath, where you can't see, they're getting stronger, getting ready. And then one day in spring, when you've almost forgotten about them, up they come, beautiful and bright, worth every day of waiting." Robert stood watching from the doorway, something shifting in his chest. When had he last really looked at his son? When had he last stopped running long enough to simply be present? That evening, Margaret made pot roast, Robert's mother's recipe that he'd mentioned once in passing. As they sat down to dinner, the three of them at the long table usually so empty, Daniel looked up at his father. Really looked at him. Robert met his son's eyes and saw something there he'd been too busy, too hurt, too buried in his own grief to notice. His son didn't just miss his mother, he missed his father too, the one who'd disappeared into work and travel and anything that kept him from feeling. "I'm sorry," Robert said, his voice cracking. "Daniel, I'm so sorry. I've been running, and I left you alone when you needed me most." Margaret quietly excused herself to the kitchen, giving them space, but she smiled as she heard Robert's chair scrape across the floor, moving closer to his son. The breakthrough came on a Sunday morning, 6 weeks after Margaret had arrived. She was in the kitchen making pancakes when she heard it. Quiet at first, so quiet she thought she'd imagined it. "Margaret?" She turned slowly. Daniel stood in the doorway, his father beside him, Robert's hand on his shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said, her eyes suddenly bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Can I help you make pancakes? Dad wants to learn too." Margaret's smile was warm as summer sun. "I would love that." Both of you. As they cooked together, flour dusting the counters, Daniel's laughter tentative but real, Margaret thought about healing, how it can't be rushed or forced, how sometimes the bravest thing is simply to wait, to be present, to offer love without conditions. Robert watched his son, really watched him, and saw that Margaret had given them both a gift, not fixing what was broken, but sitting with them in the broken places until they were ready to mend. That afternoon, Daniel spoke more words. Slowly, carefully, testing his voice like someone learning to walk again. He told his father about a dream he'd had, about missing his mother but understanding she was sick in ways he couldn't fix. He talked about being scared his father would leave too. Robert pulled his son close, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere. Not anymore." Margaret knew her time wouldn't last forever. Eventually, Robert and Danielle would find their rhythm, their way forward together. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, teaching them both that love isn't about having all the answers. Sometimes it's just about showing up, day after day, offering your presence and your patience, planting bulbs in the fall and trusting that spring will come. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Margaret looked out the window and smiled. Healing, like those tulip bulbs in the garden, happens in its own time. You can't rush it, you can't force it. You just have to believe it's happening, even when you can't see it yet, and wait with an open heart for the blooming.